How's it going, guys? Public Safety Network here. I decided to do a little more educational video today. I've kind of been running low on ideas a little bit, and so I thought maybe people would enjoy a little more of the educational side of things. And today we're going to be talking about security, and we're going to be talking about use of force. Now, I'm going to do a big disclaimer here, guys, and say that I am not a use of force instructor. So don't take what I say as gospel. Don't try to use what I tell you as justification in a use of force incident. This is pretty much just to give a basic overview to people who are new to security, or maybe someone who's been in a while but haven't dealt with use of force in quite some time. And we're kind of going to give some overview of basic terms that you would find in the use of force continuum, or whatever it is called now. I do have many years in the business. I've taken multiple use of force classes, including collegiate level use of force classes. And so I do have a little bit more in-depth knowledge than most people would on the subject matter. Now, first we're going to talk about is what is force. Force is effectively what you're trying to do is get someone to do something that they necessarily don't want to do. And as we're going to talk about later, there's a whole slew of options on this spectrum or continuum or whatever that you can use to get someone to effectively either gain them under control or to comply. So that's kind of basic overview of what force is. Now, a lot of other terms you're going to hear when it comes to use of force is things like reasonable force or unreasonable force. I'm going to explain it a little bit different in a way that was kind of explained to me that kind of helped me understand a little bit better. So what reasonable force generally is going to mean is that you're using the minimal amount of force to either gain control or compliance out of somebody. So you use whatever level on the continuum you need in order to gain that compliance from somebody, or again to have them submit to your control. And as I stated before, it's going to be the minimum amount of force. Again, with most people who've taken some type of use of force training, they understand that it's not just up and down. You can skip through steps based on the totality of the circumstances. When it comes to unreasonable force, the way that I was explained to me, and I actually thought made a lot of sense, was not so much unreasonable force, but punitive force. So what you're doing is you are using force beyond what you need to in order to gain compliance out of somebody, as almost as a form of punishment. They pissed you off, they did something to you, and so you give them that little extra, hit or slap or strike with a baton or whatever, as more of a form of punishment and not necessarily to gain compliance. And so that's kind of where you dove into what type of force would kind of be considered unreasonable. So that's kind of how it was explained to me, and that's how kind of I like to explain it to other people. So now that we've kind of gone over what is force and different force when it comes to reasonable and punitive, the next thing we're going to talk about is levels of resistance. Resistance is going to be where the continuum kind of comes into play. Based on the subject's resistance is going to be based on what your response is as the person on scene. So for the most part, there's going to be 4 levels of resistance. Again, there's different models and things like that. Most of them use 4. I think I've maybe seen 1 or 2 models that use 5, but generally it's going to be 4 types of resistance. The first one's not even really resistance, it's compliance. The person's complying with what you want them to do. You said, hey sir, ma'am, I need you to do this, or you can't do that, or whatever you tell them, and they're like, okay, no problem, that's it. It's the first one, and it's easiest because they're doing what you want. They're doing what you want them to do. The next one's going to be what's known as passive resistance. Passive resistance is pretty much they're not listening. They're not doing what you're telling them to do. You see this a lot with protesters, where they do kind of sit down, and they're not actively trying to do anything. They just don't want to comply with what the police are telling them to do. So that's going to be more passive resistance. Again, it's you're not actively trying to fight the police or resist the police or security or whatever, but you're not complying with what you're being told to do. So that's going to be passive resistance. The next one's going to be active resistance. Active resistance is again where you're actively trying to not comply, to resist, to all of that. Active will usually come in a few forms. It's not generally where you're looking to start a fight. It can be things such as pulling away. If someone tries to grab your arm and say, hey, you need to come with me, or whatever, and you pull away, that's going to be an active form of resistance. Obviously, fleeing is an active form of resistance. So pretty much where you're doing anything that's an active way of trying to not have to comply with what someone's telling you, whether it's security, police, whatever. And the last one on that spectrum is going to be aggressive resistance. Aggressive resistance is where the subject is actively trying to fight you, assault you, kill you. Generally, this is going to encompass everything. Squaring up to somebody, putting yourself in a fighting stance or position, that's considered active aggression. Obviously, trying to fight security or fight the police, that is an aggressive form of resistance. And then, obviously, any type of deadly force, wielding, bat, knife, gun, is the ultimate form of aggressive resistance. So those are kind of the 4 types of resistance that it's going to be encountered in security or law enforcement or a variety of different types of work. So now that we kind of covered resistance, we're going to go into responses and how possible ways that can be responded based, again, on the totality of the circumstances, based on all the knowledge and facts of what is going on, how a reasonable person would respond. So the way the continuum, there's pretty much, they're almost like levels. Again, you don't have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever. You can skip around again based on what's going on. There's different models. The one that I predominantly was taught and the one that I generally use has 5 steps. There are some that have 6 because there's certain steps they might break up. But I'm going to go with what I know, which is 5. The first one is going to be command presence. Most people who have taken any type of use force training understands command presence. It's simply being there in uniform, being some type of authority figure, whether you have, real indemnified authority or not. But again, it's just simply having the presence of what appears to be an authority figure present. Because sometimes that is enough to get whatever the situation is under control. Once, so 2 people are fighting or arguing, whatever, they see security or they see police show up, they may just at that point end their argument or whatever, and, the situation has kind of resolved itself. The next is going to be verbal commands, and this is when you start telling people, what you need them to do. Sir, ma'am, could you please stop, could you stop fighting? Could you go sit down over there? Could you do this? Could you do that? Giving clear and concise commands. Again, that's going to be verbal commands. So that's going to be the next level up. It's a little more than obviously being there, but not when we're actually getting more what type considered the hands-on type of force. Your next one up is going to be soft-handed techniques, and these are going to be again, this is where you're going to get hands-on with people, but you're not doing it as either defense or an actively trying to fight. These are things like takedowns, escorts, maybe a shove to get yourself some distance there. Those are all going to be soft-handed techniques. They're not designed to injure somebody or defend against an attack. They're usually again designed to get someone under some type of control. In the case of like takedowns, maybe getting them handcuffed, or at least getting them to where they're not they could possibly not be a threat anymore. Escorting someone the same way if you need someone to leave an area and they're not maybe being a little more passively resistant. You may use an escort in order to get them wherever you need to get them. So again, that's going to be soft-handed techniques. This is where we kind of get into either the 5 or 6 model, depending what you want to get, and that's usually hard-handed techniques. I like to incorporate hard-handed techniques into intermediate weapons because at that point you're kind of using, fists, elbows, and stuff as weapons. So I like to include them in the same category. So we're going to kind of separate them, but kind of again put them together at the same time. Hard-handed techniques, again, as I mentioned, they're going to be fist strikes, closed fists, elbows, things like that, things that are going to be used that could possibly injure somebody, that could be used to repel an attack and defend yourself. So again, they're a little again, that's why they're called hard-handed, because again they're actually being used as either defensive or in some cases offensive. And then you get into incorporate them into what's known as intermediate weapons. Intermediate weapons are going to be all the tools that you find on your belt. again, they're not all going to be used in the same scenario. OC spray may be used differently than a baton, maybe different than a taser. But again, I like to include them all in that kind of area. So intermediate, it's going to be all the tools in your belt: taser, baton, OC spray, pretty much anything that would be in the less lethal category, or less than lethal, depending on your training. These are all weapons that are either they're not designed to be deadly or a lethal form of force. But the reason that they're called less than lethal or less lethal is because for some of them there still is a possible risk of causing severe bodily injury or death. So you need to remember that when it comes to intermediate weapons. And the last, being the most extreme, is going to be deadly force. Deadly force being that you are using some level of force that is likely to cause serious bodily injury or death. So in most cases that incorporates things like the use of a firearm is always going to be deadly force. The use of a baton, if not used in the proper manner, striking into areas such as the neck, the head, like that can be construed as deadly force. And so that is to be used only in the most extreme cases where there's a risk on you or a third party of possible serious bodily injury or death. Bodily injury includes maiming, lost limb, things like that. And then obviously imminent fear of death. So that's kind of it, guys. That's kind of a basic overview of use of force, types of resistance, things like that. Again, I'm going to wildly stress that this is not a training course. So again, don't try to use this as, hey, I've been trained in use of force. It's not like that, guys. I'm just kind of giving people an overview so that when they go to a guard card class or maybe decide to get a little more training on the use of force subject, they kind of understand some of the terminology and definitions already. And again, what I'm telling you guys is this is the way that I was trained. I used ASP's model because that's what I know. But again, based on the course you take and who's teaching it, you might hear a little different terms for different things. But again, at the end of the day, all the terms pretty much mean the same thing. And so thanks for watching, guys. Again, I've seen a huge uptick in viewers and subscribers, and watch time and all that stuff. And I really appreciate it. And you guys haven't already, go ahead, subscribe to the channel, like the video, comments. I love engaging with you guys in the comment section. So just continue to do that. Continue to be an awesome audience. And anyone who's working tonight, have a good night and stay safe.